Okay, good morning, everyone. If you could grab your food and take a seat, we are about to get started here. My name is Peter Leroux-Munoz. I'm the Vice President of Tech and Innovation Policy with the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. This is my colleague, Alexandria Felton. She is the VP of our healthcare vertical, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Health Cybersecurity Summit. And as we welcome you in, we certainly want to recognize the sponsors who help us put this together. Without their support, we certainly couldn't do this. So thanks to Allied Telesis and Accentrify, as well as Citrix, our host here this morning, PG&E, BD, EY, and Stanford Children's Health, Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. So thank you all. Last year was the inaugural Health Cybersecurity Summit, and the issue of digital security remains a primary concern for healthcare providers of all sizes. Last year's crypto worm WannaCry gave a startling glimpse into the impact of a single ransomware attack. There, medical facilities in Indonesia, Colombia, and the UK fell victim to the attack. One of the largest agencies struck was the National Health Service Hospital in England and Scotland, where an estimated 70,000 devices, including computers, MRI scanners, and blood storage refrigerators, were affected, and some non-critical emergencies were diverted as a result. The global scope of the attack reminds us that healthcare providers in our region are not immune from these electronic parasites.
Good morning, everyone. This summit was conceived as a way to explore the unique security challenges faced by the healthcare industry, their infrastructure providers, and the patients that they serve. It is our hope that you'll leave today's event with a greater understanding of the threats they face and some of the possible solutions to help inoculate their organizations from these digital contagions. Our opening panel is entitled, "You've Been Hacked, Now What?" I'm sure many of us around the room have wondered what we might do in the event that we become victims of a cyber breach. Would we know we'd been attacked? Would we know who to call? Would we know what to tell our patients, their families, or the media? Although there are no easy answers, it is our responsibility to start thinking about how we might confront these challenges. This panel will help us to begin to think about how to think through these types of problems. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists to the stage. If everyone could come on up. And today's moderator is Henry Tsai, who is the Deputy Director with the Office of Innovation for the City of San Jose. Henry, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Tsai, and as mentioned, I help lead innovation efforts for the City of San Jose, which is often known as the capital of Silicon Valley. And it's a pleasure for me today to moderate this very important panel for how to identify how organizations can respond to cyber attacks. So I'd like to begin by introducing our panelists. First, we have Scott Fanning, who is Senior Director of Product Management with Citrix. Next, we have Jackie Monson, who is Vice President and Chief Privacy and Information Security Officer for Sutter Health. And then we have Anshul Pandey, who is the VP and CTO of Stanford Children's Hospital. And last but not least, we have Darren McElroy, who is the Chief of Operations Cybersecurity Advisor in the Department of Homeland Security. So I want to start with some background. Why is it so important for healthcare providers to plan for defending against a cyber attack, and how should organizations create their respective plans to ensure safe healthcare operations and patient safety?
I can start. I think in the last 10 years, we have seen a tremendous digitization in the healthcare industry. I think the Accountable Care Act and then the meaningful use incentives just brought a tremendous amount of work effort as well as incentives from the federal government for us to move towards a more electronic paradigm. And it's reached a point where we frankly can't do business without all of these systems being up and running all the time. It's also happened at a rather rapid rate. And then the other interesting thing that has happened is there has been a tremendous amount of consolidation as well in the healthcare industry. So a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of combining into bigger groups, which meant that the growth has been very rampant, and frankly, the technology hasn't caught up. And then the last piece is we have a whole sector of components, particularly medical devices, which have not kept up with the pace of the transformation that is required, as well as an understanding and underlying infrastructure of security on them that we still have to protect. With all of those things happening and all the data being digitized, it becomes far more important than ever before to actually manage the security around it. And frankly, we are carrying not just our data, but your data as well, because all of you are in one way, shape, or form a patient of a healthcare system, likely more than one. And so that new added responsibility, which was previously in a paper record somewhere, is a daunting task. Unfortunately, unlike most other businesses where we could just block access to it, we need to give access to all of the patients, we need to give access to all of the partners and the providers, and the interoperability challenge remains. So we have to keep open porous gates as well. So it's a tremendously interesting challenge in this day and age.
From a, product perspective, over time, I've seen a lot more proactive engagement from the healthcare sector than reactive ones. It used to be post-breach, I'd have a conversation with, hey, we got hacked, what should we have done or what can we do? But yeah, I think, the media has played a good role in highlighting the need of privacy and the exploits around it. But at the same time, it's also set expectations of consumers, customers, anyone who deals with data, that things have to be kept, confidential and private and secure. And, the perimeter and how you engage with a healthcare provider has changed just like it has with the enterprise. It used to be you go inside the premises, you have access to, digital components directly there. Now you have your smartphone looking at your doctor's appointments. You can look at, status of blood tests. You can look at, choosing your physician. And, why do bank robbers rob banks? That's where the money is. Well, why do they look at patient records, right? Because, frankly, that's where the money is. And so that creates a lot of interesting dynamics in terms of what perimeter you have to protect.
So from the incident management perspective, we do a lot of, Department of Homeland Security provides a lot of free resources for critical infrastructure owners and operators, and the healthcare sectors, health and public health sectors is one of our priority sectors. So we've done a number of assessments with healthcare organizations, and it turns out that incident management is actually a fairly high performing area, or we call them domains, within our cyber resilience review that we perform. So incident management is done fairly well within the sector. When you're looking at incident management, though, involving different players on your team, those that might not be just within the IT part of the organization, but understanding, legal needs to be involved, public affairs, your regulatory folks, and involved before there's an incident, right? So get them involved with the planning. Does your legal team understand what agreements they might need to sign if you wanted to bring DHS or FBI in to assist after the fact? If they know what those agreements are ahead of time, it's not going to take them a week to figure out the legalese, right? They'll have something in the hopper ready to go when you get breached. Same with third parties. So getting that level of preparedness down, using the free resources that are out there to, run scenarios against your plan, to evaluate and improve your plan over time, and to make it more muscle memory than anything else will dramatically impact your ability to actually perform when the time comes.
There's a lot of complexity in healthcare, as we heard, and I think it's really important today to be reactive and proactive all at the same time. So the ability to respond to an incident while at the same time working hard to find solutions to actually secure the information. And I think in healthcare, we're constantly calling ourselves unique. And to some degree we are, but to some degree we're not. And because of those uniquenesses that we've put around ourselves, we have lots of technology that's outdated. We don't have a lot of money to invest in brand new technology. For example, we have radiology imaging machines that weren't designed to contemplate cybersecurity. The solution can't be that we replace that $500,000 radiology imaging machine. We have to work with industry to come up with solutions that are going to protect that information, but the solution can't be you're just going to have to replace all of your technology. So I think that's what we're facing is lots of opportunities from a cybersecurity standpoint, and we have to be reactive and proactive all at the same time, which for a lot of organizations that aren't as big as a Sutter Health is really challenging to do because there's only so many resources to go around, and you have to address your highest risk and move forward. But the challenge that even Sutter faces is that because we're interconnected with everyone else, that if they don't have good security, we don't have good security. So it's a pretty complex problem that we're dealing with.
Great. So I want to step back a bit and talk about how before an organization can respond to a cyber attack, it must recognize that it is a victim of a cyber attack. And some attacks are quite obvious, and others, like information exfiltration, are a little bit more subtle. So what are some signs that organizations can look for to determine that they've actually been a victim of a cyber attack?
Well, I mean, the first thing is you have to have a reasonable understanding of your baseline to know that has happened. You have to understand where your assets lie. You have to understand what is the normal behavior of your network. We've moved away from this idea of perimeter defense to understanding, detection and response is the way to go. In fact, that does a better job in, protecting legacy devices, which have behavior, whether it was built 10 years ago or now. And so you can still monitor that behavior and understand anomalous activities. The challenging part is you can't software update those things. They don't necessarily give you a mechanism to do it. So it's also about understanding that new normal will change as exploits get found, as assessments of these devices occur. And so if you have a continuous paradigm understanding how threats may impact your network, then you can detect it quickly. Then it comes down to the rehearsals and understanding what your disaster recovery plan is. And cybersecurity recovery is a disaster recovery plan. It needs to be rehearsed, and you need to use different language to different audiences to get their buy-in as well. You can't use a lot of cybersecurity mumbo-jumbo to a physician who has to play a critical role in knowing which direction to go when a cyber attack has to do or alternative mechanism to provide patient care. So don't freak out when you get attacked, because that's the last thing you want to do. But you want to communicate, and you want to be effective in doing it. And it used to be you knew you were being hacked. It's really easy with ransomware, right? It's got a pretty screen screaming at you saying you got attacked. You don't need a PhD to see that one. But when you look at crypto mining as an example, where things are becoming more subtle, compute cycles and providing patient care are actually important. Look at image processing and all the other things. So if you start looking at malicious intent of Bitcoin mining, I don't think it gets enough airplay. But if you need critical CPU cycles to afford DNA analysis, and it's being used to generate income for somebody else, that's malicious intent. So understanding the behavior there is also becomes critically important.
Yeah, just to pull that thread a little bit from the beginning of your statement, asset management is obviously critical. Understanding what your assets are, but also understanding what your most critical assets are, right? What are your most critical services that you are focused on, as a provider that drive, your mission to your patients or to your customers, right? So understanding what those are, focusing your efforts on those critical services will help you narrow the scope of what you really need to be watching. And also when you're looking at understanding what, in our nomenclature, we talk about events and incidents, right? Events are those things that happen every day. Understanding what the threshold between your normal 100 failed logins versus today's 10,000 failed logins is going to help you detect some of those things early if you, again, understand what those baselines are, understanding what your normal network traffic looks like, et cetera.
I echo that. I think understanding your asset base, understanding what the most critical assets are is tremendously important. But then understanding your baselines so you can go from there in terms of understanding what's really happening. By the way, you're being attacked every day. If you don't know that, that's a problem in itself. So our CISO and I catch up every morning. Is like, so what happened in the last 24 hours? Like, here's everything we thwarted. That's how the day begins. And that's a reality of life. And to understand what that means and how you're responding to it, plus keeping an eye open for everything that's happening around you. So the partner landscape is just as important. Just last week, one of the largest national lab groups got hacked. They got a variant of SamSam, which is what hit NHS several years back. And we do a ton of business with LabCorp. So our first reaction is, okay, what happened at LabCorp? Could we be impacted? How are we protected? And then what are we doing with the connectivity with LabCorp? I mean, that's the kind of work we're doing all the time just to stay protected and learning from everybody around us, including our partners at DHS and FBI, to just understand what's going on and whether we could be impacted by that or not.
I think organizations have to have basic cyber hygiene. Many of them don't today to even have the ability to detect. Going back to the whole idea of a baseline, my team also does threat hunting to give you some perspective as to what type of threats we look at every day. We average on a month 38 trillion threats at Sutter Health. Very, very significant number. And of course, we have this sophistication to have a security operations center who's not only doing threat hunting, but also looking, what do we need to patch and what do we need to proactively look at based on what's happening in the industry, what's happening in other industries. And most organizations can't do that. So they are attacked and they don't know. And that's what I fear more than anything is all these organizations that I think the average now is 18 months before you figure out that you've actually been attacked. And that's worrisome because that means they don't have basic cybersecurity hygiene.
Great. So Darren started talking about this, and Scott alluded to this, which is cybersecurity for any organization is an ecosystem. It has internal actors like executives, IT, the comms department, but it also has external actors like law enforcement, service providers, local government. So how should these internal and external actors work together to maximize patient safety?
If you just think about internally within your own organization, you've got all sorts of different groups that are focused on, possibly different things, right? So I'm sure each and every one of you has some sort of risk function within your organization. But when we go out and we measure the healthcare customers that we go and work with, risk management tends to be one of the lowest performing areas. That's amazing to me, and that what that tells me is that the risk function is separate, has been separated from the IT and IT security function. They're not connected. They're not talking. And that means that cybersecurity is not seen as a risk management issue within the organization, and I would argue that it should be seen as that. In addition, there's that third-party risk has been alluded to a couple times. External dependencies management. How do you manage those third-party risks, right? How do you form the relationship? How do you obligate those partners to meet your standards? And then how do you follow up and complete the cycle and continue to do that over time? So there's a number of different ways to do that. We have some resource guides that can help with ways of approaching that problem. But it all comes down to you need to be working with the folks in procurement, the people that are buying things, buying services, and they need to understand what your requirements are so they can obligate your vendors and your partners to meet those requirements.
I think it's important to make sure that you're engaged with your leadership team. One of the things that we've done over the last couple of years is done phishing campaigns. It's became a competition and a break point to share when they catch a phishing attack. And we also keep the leadership informed. My CEO, if you called her today and asked her what the cybersecurity risk is, she would be able to tell you because we have those conversations on a regular basis. At the board level, we actually have an information security consultant so that if I'm not doing my job or sometimes to support me, he can share the information, not only what's going on in the industry, but also what he thinks we should be doing proactively. So another area of double check. And then as far as external partners, I would highly, highly encourage to get local partnerships with your FBI and others so that the time you're calling them is not when you have an incident. And so we have partnership meetings. Fortunately, my location has the FBI right down the street. And so we meet with them and we tell them what's going on. We actually share data with them and they share information with us. And I know that if we have an attack or we have an issue, that I can call them and they'll show up and they'll talk to me because I have that relationship. And I think that's just critically important because we're all in it together and they have intelligence and information that I'm not going to have that's going to help me respond to that incident.
Well, phishing campaigns are very important. Don't phish your father-in-law. I'm already paying for that. I think from an industry perspective, we also cultivate our relationships with DHS, Secret Service, and FBI as well. Our CISO and Chief Security Officer, maintain these relationships because, again, I think cybersecurity is a team sport. Everybody has to play a role in it. It moves too fast, also, to not to have continuous engagement because what you think the threat is of 2017 won't be the threat, vector of 2018. And how do you get ahead of that? Defenders don't have infinite time, attackers do. So that is why they can be a lot more creative and lazy. A lot of the Mirai botnet is still functioning. It's still doing its thing because, it's just now it's in the ether. It's being driven by clouds and cloud compute. So you're being attacked by that all the time as well. Hard-coded passwords and legacy devices clearly is continuing to be a trend. Right? So, when you talk to your vendors for medical equipment, that relationship becomes important as well. You need to ask critical questions like, what does password management look like for your device? How do you deal with malicious behavior? Do you have whitelisting built into your product so that, you don't operate outside the expected norms? Just like, consumers have purchasing power in terms of what they expect from their products. I think a savvy procurement organization working close in hand with the privacy and risk organization within the hospital place is immensely critical. And ask the hard questions because you do get a lot of vendors coming at you with all sorts of, you go to RSA, you see 1,500 cybersecurity vendors, each of them selling you a feature, right? Not necessarily an outcome. So you have to really ask those questions and make sure that everybody is on board with that.
I think I'll echo some of the points. You have to be in constant touch with your executive team in terms of understanding and telling them, giving them guidance in terms of where you stand and what your key operative functions are going to be over the next 12 to 18 months. You have to continue to work with risk in terms of understanding what risks are there in the organization. Security and applications and technology teams in our organization work very closely anytime we're doing product selections. So that all three groups are comfortable with what we're buying and that'll be safe in the way we're going to use it. We are very closely aligning our disaster recovery as well as our Office of Emergency Management to talk about what are the key disasters that we have to worry about. Now we're in the Bay Area, so everybody thinks about earthquakes and connectivity issues with that. But we have said, hey, you gotta look about it from a technology perspective and a pure technology disaster, and then from a pure cybercrime or a cybersecurity disaster and how we're gonna react and respond to it. And by the way, those reaction response plans are not just IS plans or security plans. These are operational plans. How will the hospital operate? How will the ER operate? How will the ICU operate? How will the ORs operate? How will we communicate between these groups in the event of us not having voice over IP available, for example? How do we move back to second, third layer technologies that we rarely use? And how do we make sure that our entire organization is comfortable with those technologies that they rarely use on their day-to-day basis, but may need to use it for weeks at end potentially if there's a really bad attack, and be comfortable in terms of being trained and available to do it. So that's a pretty big portion of how we are kind of building our resilience programs around cybersecurity.
Great, thank you. So now that we've heard some best practices, I would love to hear some examples of successful collaborations that you've seen between infrastructure providers, law enforcement, and private organizations in responding to cyber attacks.
So we had an event last year. We actually received one of the old school letters, a ransom letter is what I call it. And we didn't know whether this threat was legitimate or not, but basically what they were threatening was a denial of service attack. And for those of you who don't know, that means they're going to take down your internet presence if they are successful, which obviously could be very impactful to a healthcare organization because as we discovered as we were looking into that issue, everything runs on the internet these days. And so in that particular scenario, we actually reached out to the FBI and asked them if this was a legitimate letter and what they think we should do to respond. Regardless of what they told us, we were going to obviously prepare as if it was going to happen, even if it wasn't going to. But what they had shared with us, that multiple organizations had received this letter, but they absolutely thought we should take it seriously. So we did, and we prepared. Nothing happened, but what it did is it actually gave us a good exercise within the organization about how we could be prepared for a denial of service attack. We started a command center. We had executive leadership and operations involved, and just walked it through as if it was actually going to happen, and then waited to see if it was going to happen. Unfortunately, it didn't, but it definitely was a great exercise for the organization, and what it's encouraged us to do is do more of those types of exercises so that when the real deal happens, we're actually prepared for it, and we actually have the ability for everyone to understand what's going on.
So, sorry. Recently, we worked with a major city, and we can do the same type of work with critical infrastructure owners and operators, but we were able to actually come in, do a series of cyber resilience reviews across different parts of their organization, in this case, city departments. And we took that information and provided it to their leadership to show them where the high-performing organizations were within the city, the lower-performing organizations. They took that information and put it together into a comprehensive plan to help improve the city services over time. And as a result of that, they've built a security operations center that integrates the best of breed from the departments around the city. They've engaged with our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center to have hunt teams out, incident management teams at times, and actually entering into information sharing agreements so that they can be joined at the hip with some of the threat discussions that we have. So, we do that. We've done that a few times across the country, but there's really a lot of different ways to partner with both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, Secret Service through their electronic crimes task forces. So if you're not aware of some of these opportunities, I would definitely take advantage of them. And on the incident management side, absolutely partner early and often. But we have a lot of taxpayer-provided resources that can help you be prepared and build your cybersecurity programs and efforts over time and measure them as you go along. So that's one example. We have several examples from across the country, but it can't happen if you don't engage.
So for us, the recent one was with the attack at LabCorp, and we actually started seeing similar patterns in inbound emails. It's a link which connects you to SamSam and downloads the stuff, and then the fun begins. We started looking at our patterns, contacted the local law enforcement groups, and found out about the attack that was happening nationally, and that LabCorp was involved. So we then started working with our private partners to say, okay, how do we block this? What are the other measures that we need to take, and how much tighter should we make our inbound email frameworks, especially knowing that this is going to be more variants of the same problem occurring over the next 48 hours in particular. So it was a great work with the law enforcement groups as well as with our private partners to get that streamlined. And then we started working with LabCorp to understand what happened with them, and then how do we connect and work on our connectivity with them.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the product guy, but one of the responsibilities that we take, though, is to help our law enforcement friends also understand our perspective of our products, but also, what we see from a threat actor and threat prevention perspective and best practices. I remember a previous job I had where a suicide hotline went down with their voice over IP, and it sounded like you hung up on them. Generally not a great thing for a suicide hotline. And so immediately, not only was I on the phone call with this very small organization, these were not a very, basically they upgraded their voice over IP because they thought, well, It's like Apple, when it tells you to upgrade, you upgrade. There was no conscious decision about why am I upgrading, what benefit do I have to my organization. So they just did it automatically, and then it took down. So ultimately I said, reverse it, and then everything came back up. But legal was with me on every one of those phone calls, right? So it isn't just malicious actors. It's also things like, make conscious decisions about what you upgrade, where you upgrade, four eyes consent on certain portions of your network changes, so that if you're going to change network segmentation, or, if you look at insider threats, that is the vast majority. Healthcare, at least out of the Verizon data breach report, the insider threat is the largest impact. It's actually not external threats, and most of those are probably just incidental. So it's not even malicious intent. It's, hey, I found a USB port on my MRI machine. My cell phone's about to die. I'm expecting an important call. I'm going to plug it in. And that machine didn't expect to see an iPhone iTunes sync to happen, so it crashed, right? So, so those are the kind of things that, work. So partnership with your vendor is also important. And, proof points that they're doing the job is also important as well.
Great. So I would like to hear then on the flip side, what do you think are some of the barriers to successful collaboration between law enforcement, infrastructure providers, and private organizations?
I think from our perspective, a lot of times it's frankly assumptions, right? You assume that when the FBI comes in, something's going to happen, right? Because you saw it on the TV show or the movies, and it's just one of those things, right? It becomes kind of cultural knowledge. Same thing with DHS, right? Are they going to be able to protect my information? Are they going to go tell somebody else about it, right? So that engagement, going back to the preparedness piece, having that engagement early on helps tamp some of those down. Frankly, it's, even then, sometimes, there's risk involved, right? There's an agreement you have to sign, and the lawyers don't really think they want to take on that risk. They'd rather obligate a vendor to go do that. That's understandable. That's an internal decision. But again, making that decision with the full facts in mind is really important. And that's, on us, being able to engage with you, and on y'all being able to engage with us. Otherwise, there's also the perception issue, right? If the FBI comes in, it must be really bad. Right? If somebody finds out that DHS was here, then somebody, might there's a reputational thing there that some people have that's understandable as well. So, but being able to have it all planned out and understand, when you need that assistance, that it'll be there for you, and that understanding the risks involved from your perspective is critical.
I'm a little disappointed that you don't operate like Mr. Robot looking after the Dark Army. But, I think, the one of the biggest barriers is a trust challenge, right? And, you have to be very transparent. Threat sharing has to be kind of full-throated and about what you found, what you're capable of defending against, and frankly, what you're capable of not defending against, so that you can get the right answers. And sometimes creating that trusted environment requires a longer-term relationship, continuous conversations, building that trust model. So if you're going in cold and you're all of a sudden like, look, I need more professional help, and you bring in, federal authorities or local authorities to help you out, and you haven't formed those relationships, that's probably the biggest barrier that I see in terms of just incident response and getting what you need. The other thing is have a strong leader in your organization that has a point of view as well, so that they can get through the FUD and actually channel those communications. Because you're going to get a lot of things coming at you probably during a cybersecurity event. Everyone's going to have a point of view. You're not going to have attestation necessarily either, so you're going to get frustrated that you don't know who's doing this and what's happening. So I think having, obviously Sutter Health has strong leadership and understands what's going on, but not every healthcare organization has the benefit of a strong structural organization with good processes either. So, so it's a challenge. So I think transparency and trust are probably foundational to any relationship.
I think ultimately, there is a need for partnership, and we're making progress and strides in that area. We had the Healthcare Cybersecurity Task Force, which submitted a report to Congress, and there's good progress being made. And that was, in my mind, the first time that we had all of the government agencies as well as private sector, and that included everybody from the vendors to the providers to the pharmaceutical companies to start having that conversation, and good progress is being made. I think, ultimately we have the same thing in common. We have patients, and if we're not keeping our patients' information safe, we're not keeping them safe. And so that commonality is really helping pull everybody together. The other thing that I think often is a fear factor and prohibiting people, or at least a fake fear factor, is these privacy breach laws that we have in this lovely state and the federal regulations. There's always a concern that if we have government agencies in, that they're going to be assessing it from a breach standpoint, and there's going to be regulatory implications, fines, et cetera, that the organization is going to face if they invite them in to help them. And although there's been lots of guidance about that not happening, I think there's just a widespread fear of that happening.
I think practicing your response is critical. You have to work with understanding what your response structure looks like. Who are you bringing in? How you're bringing them in? What are the legalese that is required to be handled? So you're not doing it at the spur of the moment. You have a good understanding of it. You're pulling the right people in, both public and private partners. And then understanding how you're going to orchestrate all of this, because just having more partners into the picture doesn't mean your crisis is getting solved faster, right? You have to still orchestrate it. You still have to lead it and understand it. And so that becomes a pretty important part of the journey.
Great. So we're right about out of time, but if I can get like a quick answer on this last question that I have, which is there's a dichotomy in the healthcare industry between the regulated data and procedures and services, and those are not regulated. So how does this affect security?
Security is not compliance. Compliance is not security. So focus on the security and your compliance will come. That's my short answer.
Yeah, if you're meeting the compliance requirements, you're not going to be doing risk management, which means you're not going to be protecting patients, because it's the baseline, and we got to be way above the baseline to actually be able to protect patients.
I think you got to understand the scope of your data, but that just means there are that many layers around things that you got to protect more versus things you may want to protect a little less.
Yeah, really. If you can't see it, you can't protect it, and set high expectations of your equipment vendors and everything else too. I think you ask the tough questions about cybersecurity as part of that procurement process. That would help a lot.
Wonderful. So we've reached the end of our time here. Thank you all for your very thoughtful responses. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause.